So, question of the day is, do you need comfortable clothing? Right? We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 11, verses 7 to 12. But first, let me tell you a little story. I was out visiting my mom back in Washington, D.C. a few years back. Met her neighbor, lives right next door. She's about 90 years old, 91 years old at the time. Jewish lady, very nice Jewish lady. Good friends with my mom. But before long, my mom's neighbor says, as the night got on, listen, I'm going to retreat to my house and get my soft clothing on and relax. And I kind of chuckled. I'd never heard that before. I asked her, I said, listen, ma'am, what do you mean by your soft clothing? I got a kick out of that. She said simply just some comfortable clothing. I guess she wore and she wanted to relax in. It struck me sometimes later that, listen, Jesus spoke of soft clothing. He did that in Matthew chapter 11 here. Today I want to look at what Jesus tells us about the desire for soft clothing, or really what is soft clothing, biblically speaking. I have to imagine being over 90 years old, this lady probably understood from the Old Testament certainly what soft clothing meant. But hey, listen, welcome to Reason for Truth, where the truth comes first and the reasons come last, but where we're always and constantly learning, because listen, when we stop learning, we stop teaching, or at least stop teaching well. Today's truth is that Christians here in the year 2020, or actually the 21st century, we need to be trusting in God to provide the clothing that will keep us warm, dry, covered up. Are you overly dependent on the comforts of life that really make you soft? Listen, with smart cars, we got smart everything, smart houses, but they even have smart toilets now, smart lights, smart thermostats. Listen, your house locks and unlocks at certain times. The lights come on and come off. I'm not putting down technology altogether, but listen, at the end of the day, we might just get so far out of the way that we won't know how to turn the lights on if the power failure, happens. We're not going to know how to run our house, get in and get out. And better yet, as Christians, really, in a world growing more hostile to Jesus Christ and the gospel, we've already become too soft, like soft clothing, with the comforts of religious freedom. Now, religious freedom is necessary, and it's essential to the United States of America. But as Christians, we are unaccustomed to the biblical state of Christians and Christianity. Really, softness is not a luxury for Christians in the 21st century. And it's not a luxury Christians can, grow too accustomed to, as I'll show you shortly. But let's start by reading Matthew 11, verses 7 to 12. Here in Matthew, it says this, as they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds concerning John. He said this, what did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? There's your word. Behold, those who wear soft clothing, these are the words of Jesus, are in king's houses. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? ? Here I tell you, and more than a prophet, speaking of John the Baptist, what exactly was Jesus speaking to when he used the word soft clothing? That's what I want to look at today. Soft clothing in this passage represents comfort, really, living in the king's quarters, privilege, power, prestige, and just comfort. I mean, you can achieve that really in the hood if you have no responsibility to live off the government dole just as well as the rich can, right? And the powerful. Privilege, power, and prestige are often reserved for kings, those in power, or those who just are taken care of by others. Listen, Jesus is asking his listeners a rhetorical question. It's designed to make us think about regarding our expectations, regarding the attributes of God's messengers. When God sends a messenger, he's talking about John the Baptist here, but I would say as well your pastor, anybody who's preaching the gospel truly. And we're talking about regarding attributes of God's messengers in general and what they as God's people were expecting at that time in their minds regarding John the Baptist. Who was he? What was he doing? What they expect? A big shiny guy, living it up in a caddy, or a guy eating locusts, Listen, not in comfortable clothes. Jesus paints two opposite word pictures here from these verses in effort to show us that, and certainly in the day, the people he was speaking to in his day, and certainly I think is true for us, polar opposite ideas of what God's messengers or what God's people should look like. Complete opposite pictures. Idea of a godly messenger servant, specifically speaking to John the Baptist in this passage. Listen, in defending John's ministry, Jesus uses the words, a reed shaken by the wind, right? He's describing John. What did you expect? Jesus chooses these words because back in his day, and certainly true today, reeds in the wind were a very common sight, back then as they are today along the Jordan River there where John was baptizing people. That was a very common sight. They would have understood that language. So Jesus alludes to the point that, people did not go out to see just something commonplace or even something with worldly splendor, as Jesus said, soft clothing, which belonged to the rich and the powerful, but they went out to see something novel, something of the truth. And that's what they got in John the Baptist. You see, John was more than a prophet. Speaks to that in verse 9. From the standpoint that he was the one chosen to prepare the way for the Messiah. He's citing Exodus 23:20 and Malachi 3:1. Listen, John was greater than all from the standpoint that he was the one who would point to Christ more clearly than anybody else, certainly anyone before him. But even those that are least in the kingdom of heaven, Jesus said, are greater than John, probably because those who are citizens of the Messianic kingdom who look back to the cross can give a more profound explanation of Jesus than John could, right? And looking back in hindsight, the lesson for us in application, though, is that authentic believers in Jesus Christ, as such, we ought not grow too accustomed to the comfortable clothing of this world. Why? Because the world cherishes worldly soft clothing over the raw discipline of the Christian walk in the Word of God. See, Jesus goes on to say in verse 12, he says this, "From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force." This is almost jarring to hear after making the point of soft clothing, right? You go from soft clothing to the powerful taking it by force. See, the verse in Greek better reads, "The kingdom has violence done to it, and the violent men are seeking to seize it." The verb suffers violence could be middle voice to mean something like the kingdom is forcefully advancing itself, okay? What Jesus is saying is that violent men take it or violently seize it by force. The verse indicated that the spiritual battle or the opponents were waging war against John and really later against Jesus in an effort to discourage people from following them. And it's for this reason that we as Christians, especially in America, have to reject becoming too comfortable with soft clothing. Listen, in our lifetime, we're on the verge now of being tested regarding our faith and religious freedom. And the question is really, will you choose soft clothing or will you take up the cross and follow Jesus? Doesn't mean if you're wealthy you can't follow Jesus, but there's going to be a cost for all of us. Listen, we have two choices. There's no third option. I want to close here, tell you a story of late Dr. Norman Geisler, a good friend of mine, my teacher and discipler, and my teacher and my advisor for many, many years, almost 20 years. It was one winter storm here in North Carolina. I had stopped in. He's my neighbor. Brought my chainsaw. I said, gee whiz, told my wife, we got a lot of trees down because of the snow and ice and wind. Let me stop in and see if Dr. Geisler needs something. He's a little older than I, obviously, and see if he has any trees that need to be cut up. And sure enough, I went down, and he did, in fact, have some trees needing to be clearing. So, again, Dr. Geisler being older than I, show up. He's got his bare hands. He's moving wood around. I said, Dr. Geisler, would you like to use my gloves? Figuring he needs them more than I. And his response was, well, rather surprising. He said, listen, gloves make my hands soft. And he said, gloves makes me soft. And the soft hands don't make for hard work. Man, I was taken back by that, But listen, I walked away really pondering what he said. Because Dr. Geisler often said something, but really what he was saying was something a little more deeply, a little more profound. But I started to associate that thinking with the overall point he probably was making as well, which is, listen, if you're not tough in life, you're going to get soft to this world. Now, listen, as Christians in the 21st century, we need to be about trusting God to provide clothing that are going to keep us warm. Warm, dry, covered, and to begin to relearn the discipline of living the Christian life in soft clothing. Discipline of living the life really not necessarily in soft clothing, as we've been used to in this country. As a result, our faith will increase. God will play a greater role in our lives as he works through us in his strength and not our own. Listen, our faith will increase. Your faith's going to increase. My faith's going to increase as we have to further depend on God more than ourselves. And finally, our life will become richer and more powerful as we get into the passenger seat and really let God take the wheel, as Carrie Underwood sang, right? To take the wheel according to his will for the world and our lives. Listen, I hope you're going to meditate on that truth and the words of Jesus Christ regarding wearing soft clothing. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Promise I'll get back to you within a very reasonable amount of time. If you're listening on podcast, do me a favor, give us 5 stars on iTunes. Listen, if you're listening on YouTube, make sure you go ahead and you give thumbs up. We'll appreciate that. And 2 other things, make sure that you just hit the subscribe button. We'll miss anything, but if you got to make sure you hit that little bell down there, little bell, ding, ding, you can make sure you don't miss it. It's going to alert you to the next episode that you're subscribed to. Listen, let's make sure we don't get too comfortable in our clothing, okay? See you guys for the next Reason for Truth episode. I'm your host, Stephen Garofalo, and this is your Reason for Truth for today.